When I talk to people in the wireless industry about this, many of them are just floored by the fact that this stuff works. Frankly, it's a marvel of engineering that you can have a standard cell phone talk to a satellite.
A spacecraft 16 times bigger than a king-size bed, flying at 17,000 miles per hour, 320 miles above the Earth. It's not as ambitious as a sci-fi starship or even one of its subordinate shuttlecraft, but this giant instrument has the potential, eventually, to connect up to 1.8 billion people across 6 continents. It's called Blue Walker 3, and it's just one of over 3,000 communication satellites orbiting the Earth as you listen to this. Some of them hover permanently over one position on the planet, 22,000 miles away. Other, smaller sats skitter across the surface at just a few hundred miles up. But all of them are trying to do roughly the same thing, carry information from one Earthling to another. Now, you might think that the phone in your pocket already talks directly to satellites. And to be fair, it does for some applications like GPS. But phone calls, messages, wireless data? Well, that's another story. As we learned way back on episode 1 of this podcast, your cell phone is actually connected to something much closer, a cell site, or more commonly called a tower, at most a few miles away. For a portable handset to talk to space, to provide the literal extraterrestrial communications we see in, well, every space show ever, well, that takes a lot of different technologies working together. And a quarter century after the first satellite phones became available to the general public, we are finally at the point where your smartphone can talk to space to do some pretty cool stuff. And today, we're going to learn a little about how it all works. This is Living in the Future, a podcast powered by MediaTek that tells the story of technology that's evolved beyond the TV screen, transformed from fantastical cinematic science fiction to actual products that change the way we live and work. I'm your host, Michael Fisher, and this is episode 6, The Satellite Phone. This podcast is sponsored by MediaTek, which is working to bring reliable connectivity everywhere with the IoT NTN chipset. It delivers two-way satellite communications to smartphones and other devices, and it's already powering popular products like the Motorola Defy Satellite Link, a tiny pocket accessory, and the Motorola Defy 2 and Cat S75 smartphones. For peace of mind on all your adventures, knowing that even in remote places you can message your friends and family or request emergency assistance, keep these MediaTek-powered satellite devices in mind. My guest today is Mike Dano, Editorial Director, 5G and Mobile Strategies of global telecom news site Light Reading. Mike, welcome to the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Glad to have you. So before we can even think about connecting a phone to an orbiting satellite, which we're going to talk about in a second, you got to get the satellites up there, right? So has that become kind of the easy part now that SpaceX and United Launch Alliance and these contractors are pretty reliable for putting stuff in orbit?
I mean, yeah, you think so, right? Like, it's a real interesting topic when you talk about getting the satellites up there, I think. And it's actually one of the things that I've started asking all these companies about. How are you going to get these satellites up there? Yeah. And part of the reason is because, one of the issues that several players ran into recently is that they had contracted with Russian companies to use the Russian launch facilities to get their satellites up into orbit. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, all that work was immediately stopped, and basically the Russian Space Association is no longer an option for launching these satellites. But there obviously are other options out there like SpaceX and stuff. But even that is a little bit interesting, I think, because Starlink is a subsidiary of SpaceX, and Starlink has its own satellite constellation. It is pursuing this direct-to-satellite stuff, and so creates an interesting issue where, some of the companies that are out there are using SpaceX, but SpaceX is directly competing against them, from the perspective of offering internet satellite services.
It reminds me of the smartphone world a little bit, where you have, or even the consumer tech world in general. You have Google, which is making Android for all its manufacturing partners to use, but it too is selling its own Pixel-branded Android phones, and Microsoft has its Surface line, and it's kind of competing against itself in a way. It's interesting. I wonder if there will come a choke point where SpaceX is like, well, we're going to keep putting our Starlink satellites up there, but it's going to cost a lot more to put this competing service up there. But let's give people an understanding of the differences here between, so we're going to talk about the different vendors in a second, but just to stay on the, high altitude view, it didn't mean to do that, but of space. Well, there are differences in satellites. Not all satellites are created equal, right? We've got LEO, or low Earth orbit, and geostationary satellites, and that's basically deals with how high these are orbiting over the surface of the Earth, right? Can we just get a quick understanding of how low is low Earth orbit for some of these guys?
Yeah, you're venturing into territory that I know a little bit, dangerously little about, but I think that you're right. I mean, there's various altitudes that these satellites can operate in, and historically they've been in geosynchronous orbit or other orbits that are actually quite high above the Earth. And the sort of the recent innovation of low Earth orbit satellites, they're basically just much closer to the Earth.
So that's the challenge, right? So I just looked it up because I wanted to kind of help out with a raw figure there, and we're talking 22,000 miles distant if you want to be in geostationary orbit, right? Which is a satellite that's kind of hovering in one place over the globe as we orbit.
Right. And so they're geosynchronous. They stay above one place on the Earth. And typically these LEO satellites do not do that. They circle the Earth very quickly, but they do it at a much lower orbit. And so for some of these services, it's actually very important, because the closer you are, the closer the satellite is physically to Earth, typically the faster the internet connection is, and that faster and lower latency. And so for a lot of these services, that's actually very important. So especially this phone to satellite connections, I think those low Earth orbit satellites, that's the only way that this stuff works, is to get those satellites closer to the Earth.
So there are technical difficulties to that, because if you have a geosynchronous satellite way out there at 22,000 miles, it just sits there in the sky. It effectively, from our perspective here on the ground, it never moves. So it's easier, I would imagine, to have a sat phone connect to that. But these low Earth orbit satellites at 640 to 1,120 kilometers above the Earth, 400 to 700 miles. They're zipping by. They're only in the sky for a few minutes at a time. So you have to have a lot of them, effectively, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you do need to have a constellation of these satellites to have services that are always available. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that some of the players that are in this market of phone to satellite connections, they don't have a full constellation. And what that means is that their initial services are only available for certain times of the day, meaning that if you are trying to connect to one of their satellites, they only have so many up there, and there's literally not enough up there to maintain a constant connection. So you can send these emergency messages at 12 p.m., but not 1 p.m., because they literally don't have any satellites in orbit at that time. So that's where we're starting. We're starting at the very beginning, where this stuff is, it kind of works sometimes, basically.
Yeah, I think that would be a really effective marketing tagline. It kind of works sometimes. Brought to you by Satcom Incorporated.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The early one from Apple, that's the one that they have solved many of these problems. But even in that case, the Apple software will tell you where you need to point your phone in the sky so that they can connect. This is early days for this stuff.
Yeah, well, I do want to get to the specifics of how the different services kind of work, but let's kind of transition to the phones themselves. I remember watching, I don't know why this sticks out. Maybe it's Jurassic Park, but I think it was a much crappier movie like Anaconda or something. I just remember an action movie from the 90s where there was a plot point where some animal, the predator had ingested a satellite phone. And there was a whole plot point of having to go retrieve it or something. And it was a monster. I mean, satellite phones went from these huge bricks with mast-like antennas, just goofily huge, to, they kind of got miniaturized over the decades, but they were still monsters, to, like, seemingly overnight last year, we got satellite technology integrated into phones that are, like, literally our everyday smartphones. How did that happen? I have a feeling that you're going to tell me that the modern cell phone with integrated satellite functionality is much more limited in what it can do than those giant shoe-sized phones of yesteryear.
It is. It's true. And, when I talk to people in the wireless industry about this, I have to admit that many of them are just floored by the fact that this stuff works, because it's basically mashing together two separate industries, the satellite industry and the, terrestrial wireless industry. And it's using a sort of a mix of spectrum and technologies that are not really meant to go together or weren't initially intended to go together. And so it really is frankly, it's a marvel of engineering that you can have a standard cell phone talk to a satellite. It's just it's borderline miracle. From the advanced tech people that I talk to, they're like, wow, I can't believe this works. But there's a lot that's going on in the background, I think, that's making this work. And like I said, it is still early days. This stuff will get better.
Right. Now,
but you're right. I mean, the early satellite phones, they were huge. They've definitely shrink those down. But then the new thing is, having basically devices that are not intended to be satellite phones at all. They can still connect to satellites.
Yeah. So, and I feel like there's a big functionality difference, right? The old ones, I think, most notably supported voice, the big dedicated satellite phones. And right now, unless I'm mistaken, a modern smartphone that advertises itself as having integrated satellite technology basically only gives you text messaging at best, right? And kind of at a minimum, emergency text messaging only. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's where they're starting now. It's really emergency text messaging. And then, there's been tests of voice calling. There's been tests of higher speed data. But right now, I think in the foreseeable future, it's only going to be emergency messaging.
How does it even work? Can you just give, you talked about the fact that it's kind of mind-blowing that it even works, but how can a cell phone, which is designed for short-range, low-power comms, as we learned in a previous episode, how can it talk to an orbiting satellite at all?
It's really quite amazing, I think. I mean, and you're right that, there's satellite phones that are dedicated to connecting to satellites, and those sort of are a different class of devices. But the new thing is that, regular smartphones suddenly can now start connecting to some of these satellites. And, there's two... I think what the main thing that's going on is that there's not very much change that's happening to the phones. They're still the smartphones that we've been buying for, 10 years now. The change is that there's satellites that can listen in for those smartphones. That's really the change, is that you've got satellites up there that can really listen really carefully and be able to hear these phones that, you're right, are only designed to connect to the cell tower that, might be 2 or 3 miles away. But because the satellites are listening so hard, they can hear that, from way up.
It's interesting. You're evoking an old memory of mine, which I hope I haven't mentioned on this show before, but I used to voraciously read the Star Trek The Next Generation technical manual. And it used to, the authors would try to describe how a communicator badge on the ground would talk to the starship orbiting way above. And I remember this passage that said, the starship has to be the active partner in the communication process because it has a much more powerful receiver or whatever. And I couldn't really wrap my head around that as a kid, but it makes all the sense in the world now. Yeah, you force the satellite, which has a lot more power, a lot more available resources, to just be a much better listener. And if you have a big enough ear, you can hear somebody whispering from very far away, if that's a workable analogy.
Yeah, I like that. I think right. Everything eventually ties back to Star Trek, doesn't it? That's always a catch-all
At every
for this
episode
kind
of this show. Let me tell you. Yeah, I've been trying to talk about it less because I'm sure people are sick of hearing me Trek nerdify the whole show.
In that case, I won't go into the holodeck, but
well, that should be a future episode, really. We learned in a previous episode from Dr. Marty Cooper, actually, in the first episode of this show, about what is called bandwidth, the fact that radio frequency spectrum is finite. You cannot just put unlimited phones on the airwaves like you can't cram unlimited cars onto a highway. On the ground here, we deal with that on cellular networks through a variety of means, building more towers, reusing frequencies, all this stuff. Listen to episode 1, listener, if you haven't. But how can a satellite network preserve bandwidth to ensure that, there's capacity for people, for all users? Yeah. Again, it goes back to that sort of marvel of engineering. And I think Marty Cooper will probably forget more than I'll ever know about telecom. So he would be a better person than I to talk about that. But I think, the bottom line is it depends on how much spectrum you can throw at the problem. And then how the satellite constellation, is designed. But, basically it's just that in the case of Apple, they have some dedicated spectrum. So Globalstar owns spectrum that is intended for satellite communications. Globalstar is the provider that is giving Apple that connectivity on the iPhone. The Globalstar is their satellite partner for that? Correct. And so the iPhone has a special receiver in it that works in Globalstar's spectrum, and it goes to Globalstar's satellites. And that's how the Apple emergency messaging service works. And, Globalstar has some spectrum, but certainly not nearly as much as a Verizon or a T-Mobile. And so that's kind of why you're seeing it as just emergency messaging to begin with. And so that's definitely one of the main factors as to whether or not this is going to do emergency messaging versus, high-speed data type stuff. But we are starting to see some innovations in this area. There's a company called AST Space Mobile, and what they're doing is they're partnering with companies like AT&T, and they're using AT&T's spectrum. So, in the case of Apple, it's spectrum that is owned by Globalstar, but in the case of AT&T, it's spectrum that's owned by AT&T. And in that case, they've been able to do some tests with AT&T. But the interesting thing there is that the AST Space Mobile satellites are actually much bigger. They're much bigger than a lot of the other satellites that are being used for this kind of service. And so because the satellite is so big, it can listen really well. And so even with a little bit of spectrum, they can still get to some of the higher speed data services. They've done a voice call test, and they've also done a connection that goes up to 10 megabits a second from a regular phone through AT&T's spectrum to a satellite, which is, to get a 10 megabits a second connection is frankly astounding. Oh, that's wild. Are those AST satellites, are they, I would imagine they're the low Earth orbit ones in order to get that kind of speed. I wouldn't imagine they'd be the faraway geosynchronous ones, or are they? Exactly. They are low Earth orbit, yeah. And so far they've only got one up there as a test satellite. Hopefully, next year they're hoping to launch 5. Wow. 5 additional satellites on the way to more than 100 as a total satellite constellation. It's interesting. The parallels to cellular are, they continue essentially. Like here on the ground, we've got big radio masts for large, full-size macro cell sites, and then these tiny little picocells everywhere indoors. And in orbit, you've got these apparently huge AST-type satellites, and then these little Starlink things whipping around. Does Starlink, refresh my memory, does it provide any kind of cellular connectivity, or is Starlink just for folks who subscribe and have the kind of dish on their RV or in their front yard? Sure. So Starlink is another player in this whole direct-to-cell marketplace, and Starlink has a deal with T-Mobile. Mm-hmm. And so Starlink would use T-Mobile's spectrum, and then what Starlink also needs to do is launch its second-generation satellites. So the current Starlink satellites that are up there cannot do this. They cannot connect to regular phones. They do need to launch new Generation 2 satellites. And those satellites, my understanding is that they're much bigger. And in fact, Starlink
the second generation satellites that it had initially planned to launch, it was only going to be able to do that with the giant, what is it called? It's called, I think it's the spaceship, the giant satellite that SpaceX wants to use to launch it.
The Starship, the heavy lift vehicle?
Starship.
Yep.
Starship. They wanted to get him up with the Starship, but Starship isn't working yet, so they're going to do a scaled down version of their Generation 2 satellites that will be able to be launched through their Falcon 9 rockets. So that's the current plan on the Starlink side of things. But yeah, they're working with T-Mobile on a very similar setup with the same idea of big satellites, low Earth orbit, spectrum through T-Mobile.
I'm still preoccupied, just to before we get too far away from it, I'm still thinking of the fact that you just said that AT&T is using its own spectrum for that. And like, man, I don't know if there's a drier thing to say to like empty out a room quicker of normal folks than like, I really want to talk about spectrum for a second, but thank
you for saying that. As soon as when I talk to my wife about this, she's like, please don't tell me anymore. This is so boring. But I'm like fascinated by it. I love it.
I am too, because I love the kind of parallel, or I love the what do you call it? The mnemonic or the analogy of like understanding spectrum as kind of land or real estate or highway lanes. It's really, a company buying property on which to do something. It's just that the property happens to be in the airwaves, or it is the airwaves. So AT&T, my question is, did they buy that satellite spectrum, that particular bit of spectrum needed for satellite communications a long time ago in anticipation of this kind of semi-mini revolution of satellite comms, do you think? Or were they holding onto it, or were they issued it?
Great question. What Apple did is they worked with, Globalstar, and they used Globalstar's spectrum. Well, Globalstar's spectrum has already been approved by regulators to be used from satellites to ground, stuff on the ground. So that's why the Apple service works already, is because Globalstar already has approval to conduct those kinds of communications. What's interesting about all this stuff, I think is very fascinating, is that the spectrum that AT&T is planning to use with Space Mobile and the spectrum that T-Mobile is planning to use with Starlink, that spectrum has not been approved by regulators yet to connect to satellites. That spectrum is specifically intended to be used only on the ground. And so T-Mobile and AT&T are asking the FCC for permission to use their spectrum in a way that was not intended, meaning in a way to connect it from phones to satellites. That is not how that spectrum was intended to be used, and they're both going to need waivers or special approval from the FCC to offer those kinds of services, and neither has received that approval yet.
So, regardless of the fact that they don't have the approval in hand yet, they are still going forward with building, doing the infrastructure work and spending the money and the R&D with the assumption that they're going to get that variance.
Exactly. They're hoping they get the FCC approval, but it is not. They haven't received it yet, and there's no telling when they might.
That's interesting. It reminds me also, I used to sell Nextel phones back before we were bought by Sprint just eons ago. And one of the problems Nextel faced was that it was interfering with public safety communications because of the bands it used were kind of intermingled with those. So you had a cellular provider causing interference with public safety, some of whom are the very customers it was trying to serve, and it was a whole mess. But I think it was a similar situation of, we're going to deploy on these frequencies and fix it later, because this is the property we have, this is the spectrum we are allocated, we're going to do what we can with it. So it's kind of fascinating that nothing ever changes.
Yeah. And what they're looking at right now is it's the same situation as you need to prevent interference. So if there's a cell tower, a T-Mobile cell tower nearby, you can't connect to a satellite because then you would cause interference. So it only works in places where T-Mobile does not have cell towers. So that's what they're researching now, is like how to prevent that kind of interference between terrestrial cell towers and satellites.
Man. We're kind of coming back to it as we get close to the end here, but I think there's a tendency to treat technology as something where a new thing comes out, and it almost always replaces the old thing. So I think there's probably a temptation in some people's minds to say, well, look, cellular was great for, years, decades, but now satellite is here, and it's obviously newer and better, right? So it's going to phase out cellular, right? And I know that that's not true, but please confirm for me that that's not true.
You're definitely right. You're for sure. That's definitely the way that people are looking at this. I mean, I think, going back to what Marty Cooper said is that, terrestrial networks, that's, 20 lanes of freeway that you have for data communications. But when you talk about the satellite communications, that's maybe 1 lane total ever that you're ever going to get. There's just going to be way more lanes of capacity and bandwidth in a terrestrial network, on a ground-based network, than on a satellite network. And that, I don't think that's ever going to change. In fact, my theory is that the market for satellite phones, if you think about the Garmin InReach and, devices like that you would take into the backcountry, I think what's going to happen is that those devices, you won't see those anymore. Those are going to go the way of the disposable camera and, the Walkman. I think that cell phones are eventually going to take over that part of the market because they'll be able to connect to satellites. You won't need those dedicated devices anymore.
I need to be I think you're right. I need to be a gadget nerd real quick, though, and say I love that right now we're in this transition period where phones that don't have satellite connectivity can use like an external accessory to provide satellite connectivity. This is not, this isn't the sponsored, folks, you've already heard the sponsor part for MediaTek, but I was at MediaTek's booth at MWC, and that's where the Motorola Defy Satellite Link was released. And I love this little hockey puck sized thing, or smaller than a hockey puck, that your phone can connect via Bluetooth to. And it's a self-contained satellite receiver, and you can basically send text messages through a satellite service. I don't know who their partner is. I should have researched it before I started talking, but it's really cool. And in a world where everything is kind of becoming increasingly convergence device and the smartphone is taking over everything, I really like the excuse to be able to carry around a little extra gadget for a few years.
Yeah, I know the device you're talking about, and I've thought seriously about buying one, because when I'm mountain biking out in the middle of nowhere, and if I break an ankle, I think that would be a pretty smart investment, for insurance in that situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are this, and right at the edges of consumer tech are all these little weird things. I think there's another company that was doing this about 7 or 8 years ago, before the text messaging service, was well before they came to smartphones. And it wasn't a satellite phone, but it was kind of like a satellite sidekick, or a satellite, peak. I'm using brand names from ages ago, but it was a QWERTY keyboard integrated into a ruggedized, old school smartphone looking thing. And it was basically a satellite text message machine. And I just would love to play with these. There's no question there. No knowledge can be derived from that, but I'm fully nerding out. Sorry.
Yes, I think any device that gives me the opportunity to work when I'm way out in the mountains, I'm okay with that. I think that is that's a good thing.
Agreed. When I was asking my kind of social network on Threads and Twitter about this episode, more than one person brought up this notion that different countries tackle satellite connectivity differently, and that maybe some companies do it better, or not companies, countries do it better right now, or are more advanced. Is there a particular difference in terms of how, for example, China tackles satellite communications?
Okay. So if you're talking about how, spectrum policy regulation becomes complex and chases people out of the room because it is so boring, when you talk about international satellite spectrum policy, that is Olympic level nerdy wonkiness. Yeah. And even I have spent 20 years learning how spectrum works in the context of 5G and 4G and stuff. I cannot understand the international satellite spectrum. It is so convoluted and so complex that the companies like the Inmarsat and Viasat and Starlink, the companies that are able to wend through that regulatory process, I am just amazed at. It really is a spectrum policy at its absolute peak of complexity, because each country has its own rules about whether you can use a spectrum band or not, whether you can broadcast, continuously or every once in a while. As your satellite passes over that country, it has to adhere to all those rules. And the time that it takes to pass over that country might be a total of 10 minutes. It's just, it is so complex. So I think what a lot of companies are doing is they start in the U.S. The rules here are relatively straightforward. And then maybe they'd look at Europe, and then they start looking at other places, and maybe Latin America after that. But it does get exponentially more complex as you add countries into the mix of areas that you offer satellite services into.
You know what I love about that is that it is a very human problem, right? Because the laws of physics have dictated, and our technological capabilities as a human race have dictated that we have a certain amount of radio frequency space to play around in, and every country has decided to optimize that differently or to deploy it differently. So yeah, it's like, it would be like, to continue the car analogy, it's like if you crossed a border in Europe, call it like a densely packed continent with a lot of countries, and every time you crossed a country border, all the traffic laws changed, the way cars work changed, and the laws of physics stay the same. But
exactly,
all the signage is different. So that's I could see why it would be complicated, but I hold out hope that eventually, as this matures, we'll kind of reach toward a set of global standards that make it a lot easier to kind of stay in touch no matter where you are, because that's the whole beautiful thing about satellite comms, isn't it?
That is it. And people talk about 2030. This will be pretty much figured out by 2030. So give it another 7 years, and maybe we'll get to that kind of a future.
Nice. Is there something, as somebody who's very familiar with satellite communications, is there something in particular, one thing that you're looking forward to as it coalesces and becomes a real mainstream consumer tech thing?
Yes, very much. I don't like spending money, so I want my existing smartphone to do all the things. I don't want to buy anything else. I don't want to spend any more money. So the future that I'm looking forward to is my current phone will allow me to text my wife and tell her that the climb was harder than I thought, and I'll be home after dinner. That's what I want, because right now I have no way of getting in touch with her when I'm out of coverage. And so she's left to worry whether or not I've, fallen and ruined myself, or if I'm, just running late and I'll be there soon. So that's what I'm really looking forward to, is those. And I would be willing to pay a little bit extra for that, that ability to say, hey, everything's fine. Going to be home late. Don't worry about me. That's what I'm looking forward to.
I don't know if you could have picked a better feature. Now I'm looking forward to that too. I hadn't thought about it, and I don't climb rocks, but I do try and get away from the land every so often on a maritime vessel.
There you go. Same thing.
Trying to put one of these to use when that becomes a little more mature. Yeah. Mike Dano, a difficult topic to make accessible, but you've done a great job of that for us, and I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of demystify satellite comms for us. Thanks so much. It's nice talking to you today.
Yeah, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Now, personally, I think even more than satellite communication itself, I wish I had a lifestyle that would give me more of an excuse to use it. Adventurers, explorers, these are the kind of folks we see in advertisements for satcoms. But, until I swap out my podcasting pajamas for tactical adventure coveralls, I'm content to leave the space spectrum to those who need it. And to the TV and film characters who continue to make it look just so dang cool. If you have thoughts on space, satellites, smartphones, or some combination of all three, send them to me. I'm online, eternally so, at Captain2Phones. That's Captain, the number 2 phones, on Threads, Instagram, and the platform formerly known as Twitter. Until next time, thanks once more to my sponsor, MediaTek, and thanks to you for listening. I've been Michael Fisher, and I'll see you in the future.